So yeah, thanks everyone for joining on what is, well, certainly here it's an absolutely glorious evening, so thank you for sticking with us. This is the last of a series of 6 sessions, and tonight we're going to be covering writing your statement of regard to statutory plans, but really focusing on a sort of introduction to National Planning Framework 4 and what that means for your local place plan. So the team behind these 6 sessions has been Paul from Place at the Table, who will hopefully join us later on in tonight's session. And I'm Kiara of England, and I'm a director at ImagineIf.space, alongside my fellow director, Ellie. And Place at the Table does everything from project management, facilitation, a lot of policy work, writing draft plans, everything from coding data, training, mentoring, but also mediation. Paul's a planner, a chartered planner by trade, so has a really kind of in-depth knowledge and has been working in this field for several years. At ImagineIf, we're a community interest company, and we cover a whole range of different kind of design services working with communities across Scotland, everything from local place plan consultancy to community engagement, brief development, facilitation. We have a particular interest and focus around housing, with myself as an architect by trade and Ellie as an urban designer. And we also carry out different workshops and help deliver projects from a project management perspective. So as I mentioned, these training sessions, there's been 6 of them so far, starting in the middle of February. So you'll see on the screen there the kind of titles that were being covered. So we've kind of started off with a really general introduction as to the kind of what, who, where, when, why of local place plans, and then done some slightly more kind of introductory deeper dives into a range of kind of what we call key moments within a place plan process. So things around project management, designing your engagement strategy, processing the data, and also tonight we're going to be kind of bookending this kind of first series with writing your statement of regard to statutory plans. So just a quick reminder as well before we kind of delve deeper into tonight's topic, that we kind of try and look at the local place plan process as this sort of 6-step journey. And tonight's session is really kind of going to be covering kind of section 4 generally. So thinking about kind of developing your draft and how you're thinking about layering in that sort of policy side, which for the majority of people that they won't have come across before or had to deal with, but you might well have people in your community that can help out with that. But hopefully tonight you'll kind of get some top tips about how to think about it, even if you've never sort of dabbled in any sort of planning policy before. So some questions that you might have. One of them might be, why do I need to consider national policies in our local place plan? The second one being, what is National Planning Framework 4? The third one being, how do I talk about National Planning Framework 4 in relation to local place plan proposals that you might be developing? And also, is there an easy way to do this? Because totally appreciate that for the vast majority of people, they're not planners by trade. So how might we go about sharing some tips? And the thing tonight is we're going to share, what we do in terms of our own practice, but the most important thing is like take what works for you, but also change what doesn't as well. So this is just going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, to be honest, but hopefully we'll kind of signpost you to key things to look at and consider. So yeah, before I kind of go into the first section, tonight's kind of going to be broken into 4 kind of mini parts. The first section will be the kind of why. Why do I consider a National Planning Framework 4 within a local place plan process? The second part will be, well, what is National Planning Framework 4 and what is it all about? And then thirdly, we'll talk about the kind of a little kind of touch point on the kind of planning process and how it kind of works before just finishing off the session thinking about, okay, well, taking everything that we've kind of talked about in the first 3 points and saying, okay, well, how do we fit it into the local place plan kind of context and how might you go about it? So in terms of the why, you need to do this to get your local place plan validated. So right at the beginning in the first training session, we signposted to this checklist, which you can find either in the local place plan circular or in the Planning Aid Scotland guidance. It's also there. But tonight I want to draw your particular attention to criteria 7 and 8. And I'm just going to read those out. So 7 says a statement explaining how the local place plan has regard to national planning framework, the existing local development plan, and any relevant locality plan covering your area. And then criteria 8 being a statement explaining how the proposals in the local place plan align with or differ from the relevant policies and development proposals in document in relation to 7 above, and why you'd consider the local development plan should be amended in light of this. So we're kind of going to touch on those 2 points tonight, but really in the interest of the short time that we have, really focusing around national planning framework. So we'll not be touching on the sort of local development plan side as much, but that's something that you can reach out to us at another time to talk about, or also reach out to Planning Aid Scotland for some further advice on that. And one thing I just wanted to kind of share tonight as well is to just remember it's about kind of demonstrating an understanding rather than having a completely perfect knowledge. You know, the planning departments and local authorities understand that, you know, communities aren't planning consultancies or anything like that. So it's a case of trying to give it your best shot. And really what we'll hopefully kind of run through tonight is actually how you can also use it to help justify what you're doing as part of your argument to put proposals in your plans. So this slide's a bit of a recap from the first kind of 2 weeks, where we were thinking about how your local place plan sits in the context of other plans. So with respect to that, really we're thinking tonight about the National Planning Framework 4, and that sits at a national level. And so that forms your sort of umbrella planning policy, for want of a better way to put it. And that then informs what, you know, a local development plan is about, and also how that then can inform your local place plan. So in terms of, we're going to kind of not completely ignore the left-hand side of the diagram, but we're very much going to focus on the right-hand side, so that kind of development place perspective. And then just again, a bit of a recap there. So we've got these different layered plans, right from your kind of national level with National Planning Framework 4, your sort of regional level with your local development plan, and then your local place plan, which is done at that community level. And what the local development plan ends up being a sort of resultant of is National Planning Framework 4 policies, along with your local place plan proposals, and those are going to both kind of shape and inform what, you know, the local development plan ends up being. So it's really kind of important that, you know, both of these things are feeding into the local development plan, but that's why we try and kind of help communities to understand, you know, what's in National Planning Framework 4, because that's very much setting the tone around what is going to be coming kind of forward in local development plans, kind of underpinning their policies. And so, you know, what national policies are already controlling development in your area. So National Planning Framework 4 is your next local development plan, just with a bit of added regional detail. So with the kind of analogy of an avocado, if the nut already exists, which is National Planning Framework 4, we can then, you know, begin to think about what kind of then fleshes around that. And so developing the next local development plan is really about kind of growing that flesh of the avocado. So it's about expressing basically what's in National Planning Framework 4, but at a sort of regional scale. So what might that look like across your local authority area? And then your local place plan is an offering to shape how that next local development plan grows. So it's very much kind of, you know, around that to then develop kind of what that regional output looks like. So very much kind of informing the shape and the skin of then what is in that local development plan. And then just to touch on what other policies are already in place in your area. So what we recommend to people is to look for your local authority's current adopted local development plan and within that search for the policies within it. They're all formatted slightly differently, and the format does vary from local authority to local authority. Some have interactive maps, which are really handy because you can kind of go in, find the place, click on them, and then that'll give you the policy reference in relation to that place. Some are more kind of document, PDF, diagrammatic, and here on the screen we've just got an example of an extract from the Argyll and Bute Local Development Plan, but you can see that there's kind of spatial expressions of what those kind of associated policies are then referred to. But as I say, tonight we're not going to touch too much more on the Local Development Plan, but we'll focus on what National Planning Framework 4 is saying. So I've talked a lot about National Planning Framework 4, but you're probably, if you're not familiar with it, wondering what on earth is it. So the next section is just to give you a bit of overview around what it is all about. So in a nutshell, National Planning Framework 4 is a national spatial strategy for Scotland to 2045. And it's comprised of a series of different things. And tonight we're going to pick out a few of those different things that we think are particularly relevant for you to have a little think about when you're doing your local place plan. So we're going to hopefully take what is 162 pages and give you some key pointers about where to look at. And yeah, one thing I would say is when you're looking at this document, your kind of Control F or your find function is your friend. But yeah, we're going to kind of talk through key bits and hopefully a little bit of kind of like a cheat sheet that you can use when you're trying to kind of get your head around some of this stuff. So as I say, it's that spatial strategy for Scotland, and it contains 18 national developments, and we'll talk about what those are shortly. Also 33 national planning policies, and also information such as targets for use of land for housing. But critically what it is it's the national planning policy. So that is setting planning policy at a national level, and that is your kind of like top tier to then what local authorities are then going to have to respond to. So in terms of the outcomes of what National Planning Framework 4 is trying to achieve, the key things being that it's trying to meet housing needs, in particular for older people and disabled people. It's about improving health and well-being. It's got a focus on increasing population of rural areas. It's got a focus on improving equality and eliminating discrimination. It's also about meeting any targets relating to the reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases, and also an outcome to strive towards securing positive effects for biodiversity. So a real kind of range of things, and that also then maps back to the national performance framework as well. But National Planning Framework 4 is not designed in isolation. This strategy is very much cognizant and connects to a range of other strategies. Two examples that I've just put on the screen there that are worth having a little flick through as well is Scotland's National Strategy for Economic Transformation, but also the National Transport Strategy as well. So those are two things that are dealing with different topic areas. You know, one obviously trying to tackle the kind of travel and transport side of things, and the other to do with economic growth and sustainability. So again, worth just having a dip into those, but to very much say that these national kind of strategies are connected. Within National Planning Framework 4, it has 6 key spatial principles, and also 3 key themes. So the 6 spatial principles are to have a just transition. It's about conserving and recycling assets. It has a real focus around local living. Also thinking about things like compact urban growth, rebalanced development and rural revitalisation. So again, covering quite a broad set of topic areas, but also a range of different kind of geographical circumstances as well, and trying to find the nuances within those. And it's also kind of structured generally around 3 key themes, and those themes are sustainable places, livable places, and productive places. And I mentioned that National Planning Framework 4 is a spatial strategy, and there's kind of what it terms as regional spatial priorities. So this is coming back to just a couple of slides ago when I mentioned it has or identifies 18 national developments. And you might be wondering what constitutes a national development? Well, national developments are defined to be significant developments of national importance that will help to deliver our spatial strategy. So these are key things in terms of if we think back to those outcomes that I mentioned, but also the kind of principles about what it's trying to achieve. These are actually kind of identified place-based projects, and they can vary from a single large-scale project right through to a network of several smaller proposals. And really they're there to act as exemplars of the place principle and placemaking approaches, which really in short means actually kind of things that are happening kind of on the ground and through collaborative cross-sector working. And just to give you a few examples of those, because I appreciate the image on the screen is quite small, one of the ones that is maybe kind of more nationally across the piece would be the National Cycle and Wheeling Network, trying to establish that. And then in a sort of more kind of zoomed in mode, talking about things like the Edinburgh waterfront development or the Aberdeen Harbour. Again, there's not enough time to go into all of these things in lots of detail, but we're going to talk about where you can find that detail over the next few slides. So I mentioned we've talked about the kind of 18 national development projects, but there's also the 33 policies that underpin the NPF4. And those 33 policies are split into those 3 thematic areas that I introduced just previously. And again, I'm not going to read out the 33 policy list, but you can see here on the screen kind of a kind of snapshot of that. But also on the next page, we've also kind of provided this slide that you may in time want to end up printing out for reference when you're doing your local place plan. But you'll see they cover a whole range of different policy areas. So, you know, just to chat through a few examples in terms of sustainable places. One of the things that's interesting in terms of this latest edition of the National Planning Framework 4 is very much the emphasis around addressing the climate crisis and nature crisis right at the forefront, being policies kind of 1, 2, and 3. Also under that, you've got things like, you know, sustainable transport or local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods, but also quality homes. So it kind of encompasses a whole range of different things, both from a sort of natural environment context, but also a built environment context. And then when it comes to things like livable places, again, we're covering things with, you know, maybe a more kind of specific focuses. So whether that's to do with rural homes, for example, or things like play, recreation and sport. And then finally, you've got productive places, and that's really thinking through different ways to make our places, well, as it says in the tin, more productive. So that could be things around the kind of community wealth building policy, or also rural development is another interesting one alongside tourism. And these are all things that, you know, not every policy is going to be applicable to your place, but there's certainly several that you can use hopefully to leverage some of the proposals that might come forward in your place plans. So just to also mention, as I say, there's 162 pages there. There's lots of information, but we also wanted to kind of pull out a few useful sections to review. So when I was talking about the 18 national developments, there's a section towards the end of the document, there's various annexes. And Annex B gives the sort of national development statements of need. So essentially what it does is it takes each of those 18 developments in turn, and there's a sort of justification case as to why they've been put forward. So if you're interested in looking those up, that's where to find that information. And then the other one that we thought would be of interest, because housing is generally a kind of hot topic, is Annex E, which is the minimum all tenure land requirement. And that annex sets out the sort of minimum all tenure housing land requirement for each planning authority in Scotland. So it takes each authority in a line. There's basically a table, and it sets out kind of how many housing units need to be provided over the kind of next 10-year period. And this is expected to be exceeded in each of the local development plans, local housing land requirement. So that's kind of useful to have in mind when you're thinking about housing in particular within your local place plan and what that might look like in your place. So I'm now going to, hopefully Paul, I think, has managed to join. So I'm now going to pass on to Paul, if he's there, to chat through how the planning assessment works.
So just to say that with everything that Chiara said, in general, when I'm writing support for policies or proposals that I put in the local place plan, I don't tend to refer to the national developments very often, because they're often extremely large scale developments. You may want to talk about them, but in my experience, they're not commonly involved in the kind of detail that we want to put into local place plans. And the other thing I would say is I would literally sit down with National Planning Framework 4 alongside the list of proposals that I've got. For each proposal, I just scan all of the different policies that are available there and think to myself, well, which ones might be relevant here? If it's a tourism proposal, the tourism policy. If it's a proposal for developing brownfield land, then I'd go to the brownfield policy. And but I routinely, and I just literally reread them for every policy and refamiliarize myself with them and think about what they're actually saying about how those that your proposal might be justified or supported by what that policy is saying, and what the detail is around those policies to help frame what I want to say. So I literally read them side by side. And there are some policies that I keep coming back to for local place plans. Those are brownfield, community wealth building, housing, biodiversity, play and sport, city, town, local centres, and 20-minute neighbourhoods. Now, the other ones may have relevance to you, but I would become quite familiar with those if you can. So I'm just going to screen share. In the next bit, I just want to share a little bit about how planning assessment works. So this is a very brief overview, but it will help you understand why it's helpful for you to support your proposals, particularly with National Planning Framework 4 policies. And the context of this is that we have three main disciplines within planning: development planning, development management, and enforcement. Development planning is the part of planning that that explores and creates the strategic framework and writes the policies at a regional level in the first place. Development management are the case officers that then assess site-specific applications and read through the documents they've been submitted and reference back to the local development plan that the development planners have already written and see the extent to which they align or don't align with that. Remember, NPF, when I say development plan, local development plan, that's NPF4 and the local development plan at a regional level. So those case officers would sit down and look at those policies. And then later, once a site-specific application has been approved and given planning permission, it's usually agreed with certain conditions attached that must be discharged to make the planning consent acceptable, the actual development comply on the ground in real time with what's been expected. And there is a function called planning enforcement, where there is particular officers that can be reached by members of the community or others to investigate whether there's been a breach of the conditions attached to planning, or a breach of the plans that were originally agreed, or even development that hasn't been, that's been done unlawfully. And they all link together. So development management pays attention to the development plan created by development planning, and enforcement pays attention to the conditions created on a consent by development management. But basically, overall, the development planners have quite a lot of influence because we live under what's called a plan-led system. And so the development plan becomes the Bible. NPF4 and your regional development plan, the local development plan, is the gold standard against which development is assessed. And so when we talk about justification, what we're trying to say is, we want to put forward proposals that can be shown to be aligned with and meet the needs of these wider plans, the expectations of these wider plans. But decisions, whether they're for proposals that might go into the overall strategy or for planning applications for specific sites, Basically, the rule is that they must be determined in accordance with what the development plan says, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. Now, this is a very contested term, a bit difficult to get your head around. Material considerations are things that matter to the planning system, so that's not everything. So, for example, the loss of a view from someone's home because of new development is never considered material or in planning terms to matter. It matters to the person who's losing the view, but it's never a consideration when coming to an assessment for planning. So there's quite a lot of things that don't get taken into account, and then other things that are. If you want a primer on that, then you can go to the Planning Aid Scotland website or can talk to their advice service. Both free to use, and you can go to their website to explore that. You may want to ask me questions about material considerations. Anyway, so what would literally happen as a case officer, I used to sit there with a site-specific application and I would read the applicant's documents, and then I would create something called a report of handling, which is my written assessment of what I think about that proposal. And what my thinking would be shaped by what the policy documents actually say, and I would compare them. And then I'd write up a report of handling, basically explaining how the development does or doesn't meet the local development plan and NPF4. And ultimately, there's issues here. So when policies hit the real world, there's always tensions and it becomes complicated. And the policies themselves conflict, even with NPF4, within an NPF4. Policy 3 might say something that challenges or conflicts with biodiversity with policy 9, brownfield. And so the planner ultimately has to make a decision, and they're empowered by law through the local authority to make that decision, to come up with an assessment and make a judgment, a professional judgment, as to whether ultimately a consent can be granted or not, and what conditions are applied to that. So that's what this thing called planning judgment is. There's a lot of scope and responsibility given to professional planning officers to make a decision, whether that's to assess your proposal to get into the big strategic plan or for site-specific applications. But they must evidence how they've made that decision, and reports of handling are the place to go. You can find them for free. They're available if you type in for your region, planning portal for Argyll Bute or X region, then you bring up a search page and you can search by a map, by time period, or by site, or even by development type, and find out all the different reports of handlings and applications that are happening right now. If you want to learn more about this and see how this weighing up happens between different material considerations and policies and how a conclusion is reached, by the way, I would finish a report of handling ultimately always by saying, this is what the policies say, this is what the development proposal is, but on balance, I agree with it or I don't agree with it for these reasons. There's nothing that can help you more than being curious and reading some of these documents to see how this happens. But also remember that case law matters. Ultimately, local authorities are breaking the law if they don't, as the statutory body, assess these applications and make a decision. It's their responsibility to do that, ultimately, after paying attention to everybody else, consultees, communities, SEPA, the flood risk folks, and all the other folks like Nature Scott. And so I would literally sit with a complex application. I'd write a list of policies that the development meets and a list of policies that the development doesn't meet. And I would assess the weight of those policies. I'll come to that in a minute. And then on balance, I'd go, okay, here's what I think the decision should be. There is backup. And for different reasons, these assessments can also go up to planning committee. So as a case officer, my bosses are your councillors who sit on the planning committee. And in many cases, they might make the final decision. Anyway, almost there. Here, the issue around weightings is important. So NPF4 has greater weight, it has greater power and effect in terms of its policy proposals than the local development plan. There's a clash between those two. NPF4 wins every time, basically. until a new development plan is produced since NPF came into force, at which point that local development plan should align with NPF4 and LDP. Sorry, that local development plan will take priority. There might be local guidance to help detailed applications, but the local development plan would always have greater weight than those generally. And there's a big question around the guidance that comes from national bodies and what the local development plan says. But ultimately, the local authority is the final decision maker, except for Marine Scotland, which is everything in the shoreline near the coast and in the seas that are in Scotland's territorial waters. Big energy consents like wind farms over a certain size and energy infrastructure, and also solar farms and batteries over a certain size, they go to the energy consents unit of the Scottish Government. Or if there's an appeal, a decision can be lifted up to the government's own planners called the DPEA, the Department for Planning Enforcement and something, who have a lot of power to make a final decision. Anyway, all that to say, the two goals of a local place plan is you want to try and influence the local development planners, the ones that are putting forward the Bible, or the image here is the cookbook, against which everything has to be created. So the idea is that a local place plan, the first thing you're trying to do is actually shape and write the recipes that go into the big cookbook that everyone has to pay attention to. And so the idea is that you submit a proposal or a recipe as to how development should happen in your area, and with the hope that that will be accepted as an official recipe in the cookbook or a policy in the local development plan. Two, the second thing you can do with a local place plan is to argue through your proposals that when someone comes in with a particular site-specific application, like for a school or a house or et cetera, that your proposal would be paid attention to by the case officer as something that matters in and of itself, which a local place plan is a material consideration in and of itself. What you're arguing is that basically the case officer, who's like, I don't know, the master chef judge of the contestant, who is the developer, you're trying to say, whisper in their ear and say, look, we think that that part of the recipe is the thing that you should really judge as being most important and assess according to that. So a development is kind of like a meal. You're trying to influence the master chef judge, which is the case officer, and they're looking at the official cookbook, and you're saying, well, I think you should focus on that particular part of the recipe as the most important thing as you make a decision. So yeah, there you go. A couple of images there to help with that. So what is a material consideration? You need to try and look into that by going to the Planning Aid Scotland website. You don't have to, this is all just trying to give you added value and added support to understand how you can reinforce your proposals and justify them with the greatest weight that you possibly can. And the way to do that is basically to go to NPF4, quote that, find the policies that support your application, and put as much of that into your local place plan as you can. Questions at the end? Back to Chiara. Do you want me to stop sharing, Chiara?
No, if you can just keep sharing, just so we don't have to do the swap. So yeah, just to finish off the final few slides, we're just going to kind of take a wee bit of a deeper dive into one of the National Planning Framework 4 policies, just to kind of give you a snapshot as to, okay, well, there's 33 policies, but what does that mean and what does that look like? And so we've picked, one of the ones that Paul mentioned is referenced quite a lot generally in local place plans when it comes up is Policy 3, which is biodiversity. But before we kind of go into that too specifically, the kind of key things that each of the policies within NPF4 contain are kind of 5 key things. So there's the policy intent, so that's why the policy's there and what it's trying to do. There's the policy outcomes to say, okay, well, by having this policy, this is what we're trying to achieve. The local development plan section kind of basically outlines what local development plans need to kind of take into account. And also in terms of the policy impact, that relates back to those kind of principles that we mentioned earlier in the session. And also one area which is also quite useful is the key policy connections. So that's recognising that a lot of these policies don't exist as like silos. actually a lot of them are interconnected, and that can be really useful actually when you've identified one, for example, that aligns and helps justify your proposal. You can also look here to see, okay, actually, is there any other subsequent ones that might also help support the proposal that I'm trying to kind of put forward. So in the case here of biodiversity, you can see those kind of 5 key things that have been outlined. They're just kind of snapshots taken from the document itself. So at the top, there's the policy intent. So in the context of biodiversity, that's to protect biodiversity, reverse biodiversity loss, deliver positive effects from development, and strengthen nature networks. And then it goes on to say, okay, well, the outcome that we want to achieve is that biodiversity is enhanced and better connected, including through strengthened nature networks and nature-based solutions. So you can see they're kind of simply laid out at the top of each policy as those kind of intent and outcomes, and that really kind of gives you a flavour. The local development plan section varies in length depending on what the policy is, but can also offer some kind of useful wording around how you justify proposals and things. But if you can go on to the next slide, please, Paul. But just to kind of put that into context, so an example just from North Berwick's local place plan, there was a proposal in that, Proposal 14 said they wanted to kind of preserve, protect and promote green spaces, biodiversity and trees in and around North Berwick. So then their kind of resultant National Planning Framework 4 kind of justification in relation to that mentioned and referenced Policy 3 as an example. And if we just remind ourselves again of what the outcome was, it was that biodiversity is enhanced and better connected, including through strengthened nature networks and nature-based solutions, of which essentially, if we were to delve deeper, this proposal is trying to ensure and put forward. So as you can see, it doesn't have to be really, really complicated. And as Paul's kind of set out, if you have your kind of proposal list and you sit with that little kind of printout with all of the policies on one sheet, you can almost do an initial kind of sift around what might be relevant to each of your proposals, and then always delve a bit deeper once you've kind of done that first kind of pass. Next slide, thanks, Paul. And also, I think if we kind of go back to the beginning of the session where I talked about, you know, what is required in terms of getting these kind of thing, your local place plans validated, is having that kind of statement in relation to your kind of policy remarks. And I think, you know, typically in our experience, there's kind of been 2 options for doing this. So just to end with a very kind of practical thing about, okay, well, that's all very well knowing what the policy stuff is, but how do I actually include it within my document? The kind of 2 options that we've typically seen is it's included as like a separate chapter following the proposals. So you may have all your kind of proposals and the descriptions, and then a second chapter which basically kind of includes essentially a table where you've got your proposals, what they are, and then the relevant National Planning Framework 4 policy, or indeed the local development plan policy it's referencing. The second option is for that to be within the description of each proposal, and I'll give you 2 examples to show both of those scenarios in the next slides, but just to say really both are very valid, but generally we found that option 1 can help different audiences to digest your local place plan document a bit easier, because the reality is your Joe Blogs down the road doesn't necessarily need to know all about the planning policy, but we do want them to know about the proposals themselves. So by having that as a sort of discrete chapter, they can go and look at it, but it's not kind of all kind of crowded round. So we find it's kind of a more kind of simplistic way to do it, but equally that's not to say the other way is not valid, because that may be the route you decide to take, and we've seen it being done effectively in examples. So what do those look like? Next slide, thanks, Paul. Again, just sticking with the North Berwick plan for the moment. Here you can see that there's basically a local place plan statements chapter, and this is just an example of the sort of table description that's included. This is obviously quite extensive and could be, you know, if you're not as familiar with different policies, it could be shorter, but really what it's trying to say is, like, this is the proposal, this is the links to the local development plan and National Planning Framework 4, and any kind of justification you can put around that. And really what that means is, you know, when that local place plan is then submitted to the planning authority, they know where to look in terms of a chapter for the statement. So it becomes quite a straightforward exercise for them to assess that you've done that particular part of the validation criteria. Next slide, thanks, Paul. And then the second example, as I say, is including it within the proposal. So again, this can be done effectively. As you can see here on the screen, there's the kind of proposal details above and then the kind of policy section below. And that kind of sits quite neatly in this particular example. And again, it forms a consistency, so people know kind of by there's quite a lot of proposals in this particular plan, which was the Cooper Ward one. But you kind of create that kind of rhythm and people can follow it. So I think the key thing being, as long as you kind of clearly set out and identify where you're doing this in terms of that statement of regard to these plans, that's the main thing. But those are the kind of two ways that we've seen it being done. And yeah, as I say, depending on what your audience is like, we'd probably recommend option one if you can, just because it kind of keeps the overall document a bit simpler for different audiences. But I think that's us finished for tonight, so hopefully we've got some time for questions. I'm afraid I can only stick around for 5 minutes, but I know Paul's happy to stick around for the full time. So yeah, if you just want to stop sharing, Paul, we can see if anyone's got any questions.